Welcome to State of the Art Southern Illinois, a podcast by the Marion Cultural and Civic Center. Today, our guest is Jeremy Todd, a local singer, songwriter, musician, and performer. He talks to us today about his process in songwriting, his musical influences, and the corresponding feel between different modes and medias in life. Jeremy, welcome to State of the Art Southern Illinois. Thanks for joining us today, man.
Thank you for having me.
So, for anybody that is listening or watching that hasn't heard any of your music before, what would you say is the style of music that you do?
I guess based on the artists that inspire me and what they fall under is like indie folk or Americana.
Okay.
So, yeah.
So what are some of the artists that inspire you?
The Avett Brothers are probably the main band that inspired this whole thing. My background is like being a drummer in like scene bands or punk rock bands and stuff. And I remember hearing the Avett Brothers for the first time being like, I want to do this kind of thing. So initially that was kind of the thing that kind of sparked the idea.
So that's a pretty big departure from punk rock drummer to folk. So
Yeah.
So what in that sound inspired you to the point to depart so far from where you had been before?
So I guess the premise of that is I was the guy in the band usually that they didn't love what I was playing when I was the driver is the DJ was like the rule in most of those bands. And I would play Norah Jones, or even I would also play like Alkaline Trio and bands like that also, but Norah Jones or John Mayer, even like earlier John Mayer, and Not Your Body is a Wonderland, but you know what I mean. There was just something to these other artists that were coming out, and I listened to so much stuff, and I guess just kind of my taste evolved into as I got older, kind of regressed back to like what my grandparents listened to and stuff. My grandma would drive around listening to like oldies music, Buddy Holly, the Everly Brothers, and then old country like Hank Sr., Ernest Tubb, stuff like that. So Buck Owens was a big one for her. So and on both sides, my mom and dad. So I guess when I heard the Avett Brothers, there was something about it that was punk rock to me, about what they were doing. There's a lot of, especially their earlier stuff, a lot of like hoot and holler and kind of almost screaming in some songs. But the out-of-tune banjos and the out-of-tune acoustic guitars, but you're still getting like the beauty of the song, you know? And so I was just like, I have to figure out how to do this for myself. And I already played enough guitar to be able to write my own songs, but I just wasn't interested until like I heard that and I was like, I got to do this.
So about that with them, was it so much about the sound or was it the storytelling nature of their lyrical approach?
Both. I'm a huge fan of both of them, but like Scott Avett in general, just like his style, kind of the way he comes across. He's kind of mysterious in a sense. So I was kind of found that intriguing. But so the sound, the image, but yeah, very much the storytelling. Also, their songs are very vulnerable, which most songs are, but I guess being, coming into my 30s and listening to a song about potty humor and stuff like that from like Blink-182 wasn't the same as like listening to a song, about like how family matters or something like that when, especially after you have kids and stuff like that. I guess the Avett Brothers just kind of hit in a different way. And I was like, I want to do music for the long haul, which no shame to those bands that are still writing that kind of stuff. But I guess for me, I just needed to be able to write something that I felt like I could play when I was like 60 years old. You know what I mean? So, I don't know. I mean, those guys are in their 40s now and they're still doing a good job. So I guess I could have done either thing. But so it was a little bit of all of it. It was the look, the sound, and the stories in the song.
And I mean, the stories is kind of the through line that I gathered from what you talked about with what your parents and grandparents listened to.
Sure.
Because those are all artists that were very much storytellers.
Yeah.
And so bringing that forward, the Avett Brothers, who both their songwriting and some of their sound is somewhat reminiscent of Bob Dylan and his approach, and bringing that forward to what you're doing now.
Yeah, definitely. I loved listening to Bob Dylan. I didn't understand how good his lyrics were until I was much older, so I didn't get like that kind of stuff, especially growing up in like the punk rock scene. The words just weren't as, it was pretty much on the nose, the songwriting was, so yeah, Bob Dylan, Tom Petty even, all those guys. The way that they use the words, and they're still like, it's not, the music isn't like super technical or anything like that, but the words, there is a technicality, I guess, to the words, being a wordsmith, I guess, that's just like really captivating. So for sure, that probably has more to do with it than anything. Wanting to be a good lyricist, that's when someone's like, man, I love your lyrics. It's like, oh, awesome. Because I'm my worst enemy when I write a song. I'm like, oh, this is stupid, or, whatever. So,
well, and as an artist, you're not going to get better if you don't have a view of yourself that is negative in some way.
Sure.
There's no ground to gain if you already think you're on top of the world.
Right.
And so purely by the self-interest of wanting to improve and wanting to engage in your own craft further, having that reflective lens and saying, oh, this is terrible, but then being reaffirmed by people that listen to it and people around you and people that you care about,
yes,
helps tremendously.
Absolutely. So the very first song that I ever wrote was called The Eager Movement. And I remember it was like a Wednesday. I had my boys who were old enough to learn lyrics and whatnot, but my son Jaden was kind of in the room when I was writing the song, singing the hook of the chorus. And he came back that weekend and he was like, who sings that What's the Rush Now song? And he was just kind of singing it back. And I was just like, that's my thing. I was just messing around with it. But I was like, that's when I was like, okay, that song's sticking, like he remembered that. And I've gauged several songs like that. There's been certain songs. My fiance, I have a song that she likes that I haven't recorded yet, or I did like a little demo of it. But she was like, at one point was like, oh, that's your song? Like, I thought that was like a Tallest Man on Earth song or something. And I was like, okay, so I definitely need to do that song too. Cause like those, like I said, I'm my own worst enemy. So it's all pretty much throwaway from the get-go. And I'm just like, that sounds stupid. Or I'll get this idea that I think is so good and I'll record it into my phone. And then I'll go back and listen to it and be like, why did I think that was good? That's so dumb,
Do you have a bunch of like random voice notes of concepts and ideas?
There's like 112 in my phone right now. So, and that's just how I do it now. I want to have the notebook with like, because it's like artsy, but I don't have time. I don't have time to sit down and write it. So it's usually always like audio recordings on my phone.
I mean, that's the way Prince was. Prince literally had a recording device in every room of Paisley Park, including the bathroom. Like to where if he got an idea and an inspiration while he was using the restroom, boom, he'd record it before he even left the room.
Yeah, John Foreman, I know the singer of Switchfoot, he is, and they're not a big influence by any means, but his solo stuff for a while I got super into, and he did a challenge where he wrote a song a day for a whole year. And he said, like the reality of that is he wrote 365 songs and he had enough for one solo record and one Switchfoot record. So like 24 songs out of 365 like made it, you know. But that's really cool. And those guys where you hear their songs and you're like, man, I wish I wrote that song. They're so good or whatever. But to know that they have that many throwaway songs also is really inspiring.
And that's what they say about painting and art as well, is you can't become a good artist without having bad paintings.
Right. Yeah.
Because you've got to have somewhere to move up from. You've got to have something to contrast from. And like we were saying, it's a way that you improve yourself and improve your craft. And if you don't, get rid of the stuff that is terrible, to find the gems that are really worth saving.
Yeah, definitely. I think even in those like audio recordings that are on my phone right now, there's so many that are bad, but then there's so many that I'll go back and I'm like, yeah, I'll sing that every now and again. So like I need to keep this chorus and maybe I can use it for something else, or I need to keep this verse or whatever. So,
or maybe what was a chorus becomes a bridge for something else and can apply to something else.
Yeah. Or maybe two of those songs that weren't even like meant to go together. It's like, well, I can use the verse from this and the chorus from this and make that work and maybe just change like a few words. So yeah, it's all just, it's good to have. I watched the interview with Paul McCartney where he was talking about his songwriting process, and interestingly enough, John Mayer also did like this Berkeley thing, and they both kind of said the same thing about songwriting. It was basically just like, there's no like right way. There's no like, sometimes it starts with the music, sometimes it starts with an idea, sometimes it starts with a melody or some words or a phrase, and you're like, man, I love this phrase so much, I got to put it into a song. But if there was like a science to it, then everyone would just write a hit song every single time they wrote something, you know? So, I mean, again, that's inspiring. We watched, it's been probably a couple years at this point, we watched a documentary that the Avett Brothers had called May It Last, and they have this really, really good song called I Wish I Was. And it's like, I always say it's like the sexiest song I've ever heard, because it's so well done lyrically. But when you watch May It Last and you hear like the early stages of this song, and he's like, no, well, I was thinking like I would say like, you know, I wish I was like this shirt or something, and like I put it on and like, and then, you know, she takes you off or something. And it's just like, it's so bad. It's so like horribly stated, and it doesn't work for the song. But then when you hear the evolution of it and what it becomes, it's like, that's awesome, because you know, it's not always a home run as soon as you write it. So,
and it one of the murals here in Marion, it was a co-design between myself, Luke O'Neill, and Sean Vincelette, and it came together because of a phrase, a message popped into my head.
Yeah.
And I didn't have the graphic elements quite worked out for it. And started playing with it. I'm like, this is the essence of it, but it looks terrible right now. We've got to figure it out. And the three of us bounced back and forth and threw ideas back and forth and redesigned. And now it's this, you know, it's this cool messaging thing that's a circle that says life is art, live it. And looks great. That's on the west side of the Marion Cultural and Civic Center.
Okay.
And
all the murals look great, man.
Thanks,
all
man.
Yeah.
But that one came out of something that looked so like, it was this horrible tacky like floral design in the background over this like almost script looking writing that didn't have the right feel or vibe to it in any way.
Yeah.
And then it eventually the idea and the concept was there, but then it then molded into what it is now.
And I imagine that's how book writing is. I imagine that's how it's definitely how songwriting is. You know, it evolves as you go, and you find the right words and the right chords to emotionally support those words. And painting, poetry, all that stuff. It's an evolution, you know. I mean, I'm sure there's those handful of people who just get it right the first time. Like, yeah, man, I just write that good, but
not every time.
Yeah, I doubt it. I doubt it though. I mean, the Beatles had to somewhat be there because Paul McCartney's John Mayer's held up pretty good. I don't love every John Mayer song. I love most Beatles songs are pretty great.
Yeah.
And so Paul McCartney saying, well, like if there was a science to it, then it would just be, every song would be amazing. It's like every song is pretty amazing, man. So they had to have something to it.
Yeah.
But then you watch the documentary and no, not necessarily. I don't know if you saw the Beatles documentary that was on Disney. It was a train wreck for most of it. And then once it finally started coming together, who'd they get towards the end? It was like Billy Preston or something like that came in. Once he started coming in and laying down like that organ and stuff and kind of like vibing with them, I felt like that's when everything really came together. And then it inspired them a little more because I felt like they were all kind of like burnt out at that point. They didn't care, you know.
And they needed that fresh energy in there.
Exactly. So that kind of stuff helps too. But yeah, it's
so for you, for you, your concepts, your ideas, your voice, your notes on your phone, do those start with a lyrical idea for you most of the time, or do they start with a melody? Where is your process typically rooted from?
Yeah, it typically starts with a phrase or either a phrase or a melody. Like there'll be no words, but I'll know how I want to sing. The Single Fatherhood Feels, for example, that song is, I mean, it started from me just kind of playing back and forth between this like really basic country riff, you know, the bump, 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 bump back and forth. And I had the melody in my head, just that dun, 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 dun. And I just kind of had it, but I didn't know what to do with it. And the story of that song, in short, was I was a new father again, you know, had a new baby, and I was working like 9-hour shifts, 6 days a week at a retail customer service job. I had no time for music, wasn't writing, wasn't playing out like anything. And so I had this day where I had like the apartment I was in at the time to myself. And I was like, I got my phone out, I hit record, I was bouncing back and forth between the chords and just singing that melody over again. But every time I hit record, the baby upstairs, not my own baby even this time, the baby upstairs through these paper thin floors and walls was in every recording, just wah, wah, you know. And at the time it was super discouraging. I was like, screw it, man. Like, I'm done. I put my guitar up. And then I just kind of remember pulling it out again, maybe like a few weeks later, or maybe even later than that. And just that first line came out, what can I say on here? Can I say the lyrics?
No, we're a little bit cleaner on here.
Okay, yeah, right on. So, but that line came out, the baby was, and I was just like, man, that's perfect. And I can kind of use that, like the whole experience. Well, so I guess I'll just sit here and work this 9 to 5 and give up on these dreams of mine. It'll be fine, you know. A little bit of like self-loathing and like, you know, boo-hoo, but at the same time, and it's like, man, I bet so many artists go through that because you think you're going to do one thing and then things happen and you don't get to. And so it all just kind of snowballed into this song. And it's not about any of my own kids. It never was. But I think it's funny how people interpret songs, because I opened for the Way Down Wonders at Old Rock House in St. Louis. And it was a few months after I had played this Wander Down Music Festival that was in Makanda. And one of the guys from that festival was there, and we walked in, and this guy was like, "You're the GD Baby guy." And I was like, "Yeah." He's like, "Man, thank you for giving us permission to just not like being a parent sometimes." And I was like, "Okay, you're welcome, I guess. That's not what the song's about, but you're welcome." And I didn't tell him that. I think that's
a beautiful thing.
Exactly, yeah. Exactly. That's the best thing about music is, I think Dave Grohl said it one time, like he's singing a song on stage, like when he sings Everlong, people are singing it back. 300,000 people are singing it back to him for a different reason. I think Howard Stern asked him in an interview one time. He said, "My hero, that song's about Kurt Cobain, isn't it?" He's like, "No." He's like, "No, I think it is. I think that song is about Kurt Cobain." He's like, "Well, yeah, I mean, if that song's about Kurt Cobain to you, then fine. I didn't write it about Kurt Cobain, And I think that's one of the best things about writing music and listening to music is it means something different to everyone,
Well, Mark Morris of Mark Morris Dance Group, I was speaking with him, and he said, in a talkback environment, whenever he's doing a talkback and talking to the audience about his show, anytime that anybody brings up, "Is this what that's about?" And he's like, yeah, regardless of what they're saying, because he choreographed and created pieces based on his own outlook, but the beautiful natural essence of the art form is that however it speaks to you is what it's about for you and your experience, and whatever you can take from that is the pure means of connection, which makes that art great.
Right. And again, that goes all across the board too. Painting, books, whatever, which, I mean, books, maybe not as much, but I feel like you can comprehend a book differently.
I mean, there's a lot of metaphor in a book, and how that metaphor applies, whether it's in poetry or standard novel form, there's a lot of metaphor in there, and however that metaphor applies or connects to your life in a way that makes you actually connect to it or have meaning for you is the true beauty of what we're doing.
Look at the Bible, I can remember being in a Bible study one time, and I can't remember I'm so far removed from passages at this point, but I remember a girl literally crying. It was a little bit dramatic, but she was like, the part where when all things are said and done, the lions and the lambs will lay together. And I think that's so cool that the lions and the lambs are literally going to be laying next to each other. And so many people in the room was like, well, I don't think it specifically means lions and lambs are going to lay next to each other, but she took it literally.
And she saw the beauty in it.
And she saw the beauty and it made her cry. So, and that's cool. And the other people that were like, no, dude, that's not what it means. I mean, they couldn't really say what it meant either. And I was like, and they weren't even necessarily agreeing, So, and I think that's cool. I remember the first time I read Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut, and we were debating that in a composition class. And I was I was stressed out because there were so many opinions flying around that room. And I was just I just liked the book, man.
Well, and Vonnegut beautifully leaves so much ambiguity for interpretation within his work that really opens itself up to that debate.
Yeah. And that book was great. I mean, I haven't read a ton of his stuff. I wish I could sit here and be like, oh man, I've read everything by Kurt Vonnegut. I have a book called Jailbird that I haven't even opened. We got it at a rummage sale one time. You like the book? I don't know it. But Cat's Cradle, I read that, and is it Breakfast of Champions?
Breakfast of Champions.
So those are the 3 books I've read, and all of them are just the best. They're all so good. But then I don't know, man. Yeah, it is books, but I guess to get to my point was just that's another thing that all across the board, art is just in general, whether you're writing a book or painting a picture or writing a song or doing a dance, an interpretive dance or slam poetry or whatever. It kind of can be interpreted different and make 10 people feel 10 different ways, which is great.
But the important thing is that they're feeling and connecting.
Exactly. That's the most important thing. That is why I do this.
Which brings me to an additional line of connection for you and your work.
Yeah.
You've recently released 2 different music videos.
Mm-hmm.
And one, what are those 2 music videos? They correspond to singles that have been released already, right?
Yeah. Those are both songs that are going to be on the upcoming record that comes out
tomorrow.
Tomorrow. So yes, Friday, May 27th. correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, the first song that was released, it was released on Valentine's Day. It's called A Realistic Love Song. And it was about, I mean, the initial concept of that song was something, I think, like I was in a relationship at the time, and I think the person that I was in the relationship with said something like, sometimes love just isn't enough to be. And I was like, so you have to do all these things, loving somebody isn't enough. You have to do all these things to show them or whatever. And so that was the initial concept. The song isn't about the relationship necessarily or anything like those things that happened. I was just kind of going through my Rolodex of, cliche things that people do, opening car doors, buying flowers. And since it's about kind of a dysfunctional relationship, a love song that isn't traditional in the sense that it's like this great, love story or anything. For the music video, I told Kylie at Half Moon Digital, which is who did the music video, both music videos, that I wanted to do something very Wes Anderson. I love Wes Anderson movies. And his movies are very much about dysfunctional relationships, to the point where you don't know if you're supposed to laugh or if you're supposed to cry or if you're supposed to feel good or bad about what's happening, maybe minus Fantastic Mr. Fox. That's just a pretty feel good one. But like Royal Tenenbaums, such an uncomfortable movie for so many different reasons. And Bottle Rocket, and Darjeeling Limited, it's like my favorite movie, one of my all-time favorite movies. And the dysfunction of the relationship between the three brothers, but then also like the mom and the dad that has passed away, and like they're trying to find themselves on this trip. And it's just, I was like, we have to do a Wes Anderson concept for this dysfunctional love song. It has to be Wes Anderson-esque,
Well, they nailed the cinematography, because as soon as you said Wes Anderson, I immediately, just simply the color grading of the music video is...
That was all Kylie.
It totally aligns with Wes Anderson immediately as soon as it comes on.
Yeah, definitely. And then for the second single, which is the single Fatherhood Feels of Corey Dean, wanted to do something completely different. The video just kind of starts off with like it's me looking in a television of myself, kind of distorted, playing music with my band, but then like kind of zones out to me sitting in a waiting room waiting for this therapist to come and talk to me. And that was like, I remember when he very first sent me, he's like, here's going to be like the 20-second trailer for this. And it was just kind of that very beginning of it. And it sounds like, I think when he sent it, I was in like Target's parking lot with my fiance or something. And we watched it, and it was like, man, like we need to see the rest. It sounds like a panic attack, and that's very much like what it is sometimes, and not to alleviate like, or to make light of, I guess, postpartum for like moms and stuff like that. But for like dads too. I mean, like it's both parents. It changes like your life for the good for the most part, but it sucks sometimes, being a parent. And that's just kind of what the song was about. It's like, man, like I'm not getting to play music. I'm not getting to do this. I'm not getting to do that. But I think he brought some light to the video where like there's scenes where I'm like wrestling around with the kids and stuff like that. And I think my daughter Elowen's like loving on me pretty good in one point, which is really, really awesome. And
the moment when she flips over the top of you,
yes,
it brought underlying joy into the video as a representation, as a counterpoint to some of the lyrics in the song.
Yeah,
it was really beautiful.
Which is good happened. Because because I loved that guy connected, the guy that spoke to me about the song at the venue. I'm glad it made him feel any way that he needed to feel, or give him permission for whatever he felt he needed permission for. But the song is just, it kind of made me feel bad in a way. I was like, man, well, I hope people don't listen to this song and think that like I hate being a parent or like I hate my kids, because of the title of the song. Even I played that song for the very first time at this venue in Effingham called Effing Brew, and there was a good crowd there. A bunch of my friends were there, and the kid that's playing bass with me now, we used to be cousins. I have a pretty dysfunctional family, so used to be cousins with lots of people at one point, I feel like. But Corey came up to me afterwards and said, he's like, man, that song hit me right in the single fatherhood feels. And I was like, that's awesome, because that song's called The Single Fatherhood Feels of Corey Dean, and that's like his name. It's Corey Dean Nighty. And that just stuck. I was like, I'm going to call the song that, even though that's a pretty lengthy title. I'm going to call the song that, because I want that to resonate. I want my songs to resonate with people.
Well, that title sets you up to listen for a ballad, a story,
right? Like, what is
really
this? What's this about? The single father. What is this guy's story? And it's my story. I mean, the song is from my perspective in that certain point in my life. That's what most of the songs on the record are about. Something I was going through, and I mean, some of them are like embellished a little bit. It's not like all factual, like, man, this happened, or
you're not singing a documentary.
No, exactly. Yeah. But it's all personal, like, reference though, which is good. My favorite songwriters write from those perspectives. I found out at one point, Shaky Graves, who's a huge influence also, but most of his songs are not about him. They have nothing to do with him. And I was like, well, man, that's a bummer. But he'll read like a newspaper article, or he has this song called, I think it's called Cops and Robbers, on his record Can't Wake Up. And it says, the chorus is crime, it's a young man's game. And he said he got into a cab, and this taxi driver was just like basically like bragging about this life of crime he used to live. And they're like, oh, so you're pretty wild. And he's like, no, man, not anymore. He's like, crime, that's a young man's game. And he's like, I remember just like saying that into my phone, like, crime, that's a young, and that song is so awesome. And it just talks about all these different scenarios, probably from stories. But when I used to listen to his stuff, I was thinking like, man, this is crazy. Like the stuff that he's like been through or singing about or whatever. And not necessarily. But then you have artists like Jason Isbell who write from a pretty, personal, it's mostly his stories and stuff like that, which I think is awesome. So, and that's something I want to do maybe with other records, is not write so much from a personal standpoint, but I feel like most of my favorite records are the artists like Jagged Little Pill from Alanis Morissette. Like, that record is so amazing because that's her story that she's telling from start to finish. And it's just like, dang.
At the same time, I was listening to a comedian on a podcast recently, and he was saying, what I'm going to put into my hour is, the 1 hour act that he's doing. He said, I have to be careful as to what I'm willing to put in there, because it's what I'm going to emotionally relive on repeat for the next year and a half.
Definitely.
And so what you're putting into your album, what you're putting into the songs that you're going to be playing on repeat whenever you play out, is what you're going to be living through in those moments over and over and over again.
Yeah, for sure. There's a song on the record called The Difference, and I wrote it from the perspective of my grandma, which feels weird to say considering the song is about the difference these people feel in their kiss versus like other relationships. I feel like when, I've been in those relationships where you've like kissed someone and like there's just not that magic, but it's, it's whatever. And then you kiss someone else and it's like, man, like I'm supposed to be with this person, and it never like fizzles out in the relationship or whatever. And that song, I remember thinking about that. And honestly, I think I watched this movie. It's like an old movie from the 90s, maybe, called Love Potion Number 9. And I can't remember who's in it. I want to say like Sandra Bullock's in it, but I don't know if that's true.
I think it is.
But the Kiss, when they drank this love potion, if it wasn't like meant to be or whatever, it tasted like donkey spit, I guess is like what they said, you know? And I just remember thinking about like that movie, and it's just how my mind works, I guess. But I was thinking about that movie and watching that movie with my grandma and thinking about how she basically was married to my dad's dad. They got divorced when my dad was 11. And because my dad was a brat, she had no other relationship in her entire life, you know? And I was just like thinking about all these like really like beautiful things she could have had with somebody. And that's kind of like what the song is about. The song is about like this guy, like just, you know, kind of rubbing his fingers through her hair and thinking about this amazing life that they would have had together, and being together, you know, through the death of one of them at the end of the song, but just kind of like smiling and being, you know, enjoying all that time that they had, all these scenarios that they had together, but not necessarily it's not from my personal perspective, you know, but it's from like the perspective of somebody in my life, I guess, you know, which I think is important too. But I guess to make the point, sometimes when I sing that song, it feels like super emotional. And then other times I can just like sing it and it's not that big of a deal. So it depends on where I'm at in my feels and my mental state. But I think that's important too. I think when you watch, to go back to the Avett Brothers, they have this song called Through My Prayers. And I've seen them perform that song and get like teary-eyed. And I believe the song's about their aunt that they're never going to see again. And that's the only way. I guess it didn't, maybe the relationship didn't end on good terms before she passed. And like now the only way they can talk to her is like through their prayers and whatnot. And I'm just like, man, what a beautiful like song, you know? The story is so good. So, but yeah.
And that's what you said there is what, you know, it depends on where you're at in your feels on how that song's connecting to you at the time. But I don't know if all people truly understand about performing publicly and opening yourself up is that you're literally opening yourself up and opening former wounds and opening your emotions every time that you're up there pouring out. Otherwise, it's a flat performance. And so you're literally opening yourself up so that others can enjoy it and can connect, but you're sacrificing yourself through that.
Yeah, I have a lyric in a song that I haven't recorded that I want to record, but it's I can't think of it right now. But basically it just talks about like ripping yourself wide open, like while all these people cut loose on a dance floor, you know, they're having the time of their lives listening to you sing these songs that are just like killing you to like relive. That's a super dramatic. It's like every time I sing those songs, I'm like, man, this is depressing. But it is in a sense. It's like, man, this was like not a good time when I wrote this song, or even the Eager Movement. It was just like the first line is like about going through a divorce, kind of, you know. I was raised to treat a girl right. I swore I'd love the same one all my life. I wasn't going to have the same life that my parents had. My parents have been married like 4 times apiece. And I remember when I was going through my divorce, I was like, man, I said I was never going to be like my parents. I wasn't going to have this dysfunctional family. My kids were going to be raised right in a family with 2 people forever. And it just didn't pan out that way. But that song came from it, part of it, and worked out good. I mean, you know, for that tune. So yeah, I think it's important to write from a personal perspective for myself. I think the vulnerability really adds to like the emotional connection, whether you're watching someone perform it live or listening to the record in your car or whatever. So it makes it a lot more relatable, which means people are probably going to keep coming back to it, hopefully.
Yeah. And that's not possible without that vulnerability and
Right.
without.
I don't think so. Not for me, it's not. It is rare that I come back to in like 2002, I was like a poster child for this band called The Used. I mean, I had the shirts and like, the look. I loved this band. I talked about them all the time, kind of like I do with Father John Misty now, but I loved this band, but it's rare. Blink-182, Green Day, I've listened to all these like pop punk and like screamo bands and stuff, but it's rare that like I go back to their songs now and it's like relatable to my life now currently. But you listen to like the Avett Brothers or there's a band called Mandolin Orange. They're called something different now. I think like Watch House. Just super vulnerable songs. Or most songwriters, Bob Dylan, Gillian Welch, and David Rawlings, their songs are just like, they hit like this emotional trigger every time you listen to it. And I might not always be in the mood for that. Sometimes you just want to listen to something fun. And that's when maybe you'll go back and listen to like, oh man, I remember when I was in high school and this song, or whatever. But yeah, I think for me, that's a big part of it is like the emotional element of the song. So I try to do that like with my songwriting for the most part. I grew up in church. I led praise and worship for like 13 years and had like this kind of falling out with the church. And I mean, a couple of the songs touch on that a little bit. And I felt like that was important. But part of me is also scared for like those people that I went to church with for like 25 years to be like, man, like, was this experience that miserable? No, but for songs, it's important to be honest about the story, but it wasn't that miserable, but
it was in that moment.
But it was in that moment, yeah. When I had to kind of like step away from everything, it was like important for me to, because I hope people don't listen to those songs and like, man, this guy like hates God or this guy worships Satan or something like that, because it's not even true at all.
And songs have this beautiful aspect that essentially they're a time capsule of when you were writing it, moment in which you were writing it, not a span of 5 years in one song.
Yes.
And so there's an importance to understanding that's, while it may be relevant to some people at that moment and may not be at another moment.
Yeah.
But it's that moment for you that has been transferred through songwriting.
Right. Exactly. And that's what every one of these songs are. They're not even, I'm in different moments now, some of these songs were written in 2015. So several years ago. But I felt like I had to record them and get them out on like one solid thing before I could move on to like the new songs. I didn't feel right to not have these songs recorded and put out. And not all of them were. Some of them were like 3 or 4 of the songs are like pretty brand new, within like the last year and a half. And then, like I said, other songs are like 2015.
Now, for you, is songwriting somewhat of an emotional process for you? Like, is that how you process your emotions, or is it just a way of?
Yeah, I think so.
And is that where the importance in these need to go down, these need to be recorded as a means of closure for you?
Yeah, and Yeah, because I can be closed off. I got called recently, not very empathetic. There's a bird. There's a bird that got taken out of its nest, brought up on a wire, a phone line or a power line or whatever, and dropped because my fiance was in a verbal altercation with the bird that took the bird from the nest. And she was like having an emotional meltdown with this bird. And I was like, look, baby birds, like the likelihood that they're going to live anyways is not very good. Like baby birds die a lot. And I don't even know if that's totally true. Someone listening might be like, this guy doesn't know anything about birds. I don't, but I remember these robin eggs hatching on my porch one time, and I went out there being very empathetic and made sure they were okay every day. 4 birds hatched. They were doing their little chirp, making sure they were getting fed and whatnot. 3 of them died out of the 4, and I was sad, but not much you can do. So I think I tend to be more closed off in like person, but then can like put something into a song. It's like how I'm really feeling, about something. My fiance also is like, oh, you never write songs about me or whatever. I do, I have them, but I want them to be right. You know what I mean? When it comes out, it needs to be, or like I might have this verse that's perfect or this chorus that's perfect. The rest of it needs to measure up to the rest of it. I don't want to just man, this song started out strong, but then it just kind of went off on whatever. So yeah, I think that's where my feelings always go, is into my songwriting. I watched an interview with Rob Thomas one time saying that he had this perfect relationship with his wife and it wasn't working out for his songwriting. So he would pick fights with her so he could write songs, or make up with her from the fights so he could write a song about that experience or whatever. And I thought that was kind of cool. And I don't do that or anything, but I think most artists are kind of closed off, like emotionally, like in person, and then but can write these like really good songs. Are comedians sometimes are some of like the most backward people that you'll meet, and but then you'll hear their comedy and it's like, man, they're a real person, because the stuff that they're talking about is so like deep. I feel like comedy is not the same now as it was like when you used to watch like Robin Williams or Eddie Murphy do stand up. I'm like telling my age now, but
yeah, but it's really evolved. It's
yeah,
become a storytelling
for sure,
a vehicle as well. That the storytelling has highs and lows, and
yeah,
Mike Birbiglia, who we were speaking about before the podcast, and the nature of his comedy really follows that storytelling arc, and there's some emotional stuff.
Yeah.
But that builds a brighter contrast to the funny whenever you as an audience, whenever you're experiencing the lows with them, and then the funny moment shines brightly above it.
Yeah.
It builds a more enriched experience for everyone there, and builds more connection rather than, hey, we're laughing at these jokes with you. They come out with true fans who are connected to them in an emotional way, as opposed to just, hey, you're a funny dude.
Right, which is different. I know, which I didn't get into it as much, but like Bo Burnham, he put out that thing after the pandemic, and I guess like tons of people related to it because it was basically just like depressed writing comedy in his apartment or whatever. And I was also super tired when I watched it, so I probably need to go back and like give it another chance. But my initial response was like my son was like, man, it was so good, and like just so like, and I was just like, I mean, I watched it and I fell asleep, man. I was not digging it. But then you watch Dave Chappelle, who's like, super controversial or whatever, but sometimes I feel like there's this huge message at the end of it. It's like he's been telling these like funny stories, and some of them controversial, some of them just funny, but at the end he makes like this point that is just usually pretty good, that, we don't need to take certain things so seriously and just assume that everybody's out to get us because of a joke or because of a punchline or whatever. And his stuff I've really, really enjoyed. So yeah, I think coming back to like the vulnerability aspect of it though, I think comedians have really, I don't ever remember watching stand-up comedy like in the 90s and stuff and being like, man, this guy's being super vulnerable, or this is really emotional. And now you watch stand-up comedians and it's like, dang, there's like a heaviness to this, Or,
yeah, I mean, like back then you had like Seinfeld and Leno and
exactly.
And they were great jokesmiths.
Great. Yeah.
And you move forward and you've got like Mitch Hedberg who also had zero emotional vulnerability up there.
None.
He was just a jokesmith and brought it one after another, after another, after another.
His opening joke on Letterman, the very first time he was there, was like, dogs are forever in the push-up position. Followed by, I'm aware that joke's not funny. On Letterman.
Yeah.
And like the response was just kind of like awkward. And then he's just standing there being like, yeah, and like David Letterman loved him. I think he's like one of the only comedians he's had back like 2 or 3 times versus like usually he just has somebody once and it's like one and done, But yeah, that's a perfect example. There's not a lot of like emotion or like vulnerability to a joke that's like, I used to do drugs, I still do, but I also used to.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, it's funny.
Yeah, he was a great wordsmith.
Great, yeah.
And a great jokesmith, but there was no vulnerability in his act.
No.
And whereas a lot of comedians today are getting a lot more real with people and letting people in a lot more. And it's a completely different game. You're there for an overall experience and connecting to a person, which is where it more closely aligns to music than I think comedy ever has.
Yeah.
Is that they're taking you on an emotional ride in the same way that a musician is.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think 10 years ago, I wouldn't have driven around in my car listening to stand-up comedy. I mean, Mitch Hedberg, maybe. But now we were on our way back from playing a music festival this weekend before last, and we listened to this Daniel Sloss, who I talked about a little bit before we started this. And there's this one thing, I don't want to give it away because I want you to watch it, man. It is insane. But he tells the joke, and then he says this really like insane thing about the joke. And he's like, this is my favorite part of the whole show. Watching 3,000 people's buttholes just go. And that's exactly what happened, because he tells this thing and it's like,
and then he just hits you with this shock value.
Well, that's not funny. And he's like, and you didn't know whether to laugh, and don't you dare laugh because it's not funny. You didn't know whether to cry, and you didn't know whether to look down, and don't look down because, and then don't. I looked up, but you're like, oh, but he doesn't believe in God, so I didn't know if I should look up. And it's just like, it's so awkward. And he's like, I'm going to take a drink of water because there's still a lot of tension in this room right now. And he moves away from it, and it's amazing. It's one of the best stand-up things. For somebody that I didn't know, it's easy to watch like Dave Chappelle because he's so, in the media and stuff like that, and you want to see what that's all about, or actors that are stand-up comedians like Bill Hader or Amy Schumer and stuff like that. Sarah Silverman is hilarious.
But all of them started in comedy before they were actors.
Yes.
I mean, they're comedians at their core.
Yeah.
And then they through their comedy have become an actor, which is again back to that storytelling, back to that connection and
Seth
that emotional
Rogen,
role.
Who I guess started doing stand-up when he was like 13 or something like that. He put out a book called Yearbook, which I've only read one chapter of, but holy crap. It's he's talking about his grandparents and how he had no relationship with his grandparents. And he started putting that into his routine, and his grandparents came to a show, and he's like, oh no, but like, this is what I wrote, so I got to say it. And he said his grandparents were dying of laughter. And he said, then they started coming to shows and they would get mad if I didn't talk about them in my stand-up routine. And it talks about like this beautiful relationship that it ended up giving him and his grandparents, because he was able to be vulnerable through his comedy about this like hole that he felt like he had with his relationship with his grandparents that turned into be this like beautiful relationship that he had with them. And that whole first chapter is just about that. And I'm just like, dang, I feel like I just heard like a really good song, you know, or read a really good poem, and it's a bit, but it's not a bit because it's factual. But used to bits weren't so vulnerable, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
It was just, especially in the 90s, it was lots about just like making fun of things that like we can't make fun of anymore, or we can't say anymore, or whatever. And yeah, it's cool.
But there's a beauty to being funny in a more creative and a more vulnerable way.
Definitely. It's comedy. I don't know that it used to be considered like an art necessarily. It was just a guy getting up there talking about it, artistic in the way that it's someone's perception of like the world that they live in. But now it can't be argued, I don't think, at all. It's definitely art.
Mm-hmm.
Comedy is art. So,
well, hey, Jeremy, thank you for joining us today, man. This has been great. It's
Yeah,
been great hanging out,
definitely.
and
It's fun.
we look forward to exploring your emotional vulnerability whenever the album drops tomorrow.
Please do. Yeah.
And I assume it's going
songs.
to be available on all streaming platforms.
All streaming platforms. So yeah, Spotify, Apple, Google, Amazon, Deezer. I don't even know what Deezer is, but is one I released it myself through DistroKid,
Mm-hmm.
and they put it on all these platforms. And I don't know half of them, but Spotify and Apple Music are the big ones. That's usually what I promote, but it's on everything. So if you're like Neil Young and have some beef with Spotify,
Kick over to Apple,
or
to Google,
Deezer. Yeah,
or
exactly.
to Amazon Music, or wherever.
But yeah, it's going to be on everything. And then physical copies, I'm working on that. It's a crazy.
They'll come.
Yeah, they'll come. And I'm working on setting up some type of a record release show as well.
Awesome.
So, yeah.
Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thank
we
you.
appreciate having this conversation and sharing so much about your process with us, man.
Definitely, man. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you for joining us for State of the Art Southern Illinois, a podcast by the Marion Cultural and Civic Center, focusing on artists, artisans, musicians, arts organizations, and arts events in Southern Illinois, as well as national touring artists coming to the Marion Cultural and Civic Center. Special thanks to Jeremy Todd for being our guest today, as well as providing the soundtrack for today's episode. Additional special thanks to AJ Rice, our associate producer. Catch us here every Thursday for new episodes on whatever podcast platform you like to listen.
How do I tell her that I love her when I've tried so many ways? How do I say, girl, I love you without actually saying anything? Well, I opened up her car door and she said, thank you, sir, but I'd like to be left alone. I even stood outside the pouring rain with flowers in my hands. She would not let me in. So how do I tell her that I love her when I've tried so many ways? How do I say, girl, I love you without actually saying anything? I called her on the telephone, well, it just rang and rang. She would not answer me. So I went right out and bought a ring myself, got down on one knee, is what she said. Sometimes life don't